As you just heard, we are recording this program today, and it will be available on the Hood Museum of Art's YouTube channel in the near future. Welcome to our ongoing series, Conversations and Connections, and today we're talking about technology and kinship. My name is Sharon Reed. I'm the Programs and Events Coordinator here at the Hood Museum of Art. Our program today will run for approximately 1 hour, and there will be time for questions at the end. So please jump in anytime, because I know sometimes you have a question in the middle and you want to jump in, you don't want to forget it. So feel free to pop it into the Q&A the moment you have it, it's fine. And then we will find it at the end. For those of us who have just signed on, we have launched a quick poll. If you would take a moment to fill that out, that would be very helpful. Thank you. And if you're also joining us, if you missed it earlier, just let us know in the chat or the Q&A where you're joining us from today. And now I would really like to turn this over to my wonderful colleague, Jami Powell, Associate Curator of Native American Art. Jami?
Thank you, Sharon, and thanks as always for all of the work you do in organizing these events and making sure that they run incredibly smoothly. It is difficult work and you make it look very effortless. So thank you as always for your support. I'd like to start today with a land acknowledgement. The Hood Museum of Art at Dartmouth is situated upon the ancestral and unceded lands of the Abenaki peoples. This acknowledgement reminds us of the significance of place, the continued existence of Indigenous peoples, and the museum and Dartmouth's commitment to building respectful relationships with those who call these lands home today. Thank you again for joining us today. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to take a moment to recognize the Diversifying Art Museum Leadership Initiative funded by the Ford and Walton Family Foundations that created the opportunity for the exhibition Form and Relation, Contemporary Native Ceramics. For those of you in Hanover, you can purchase a copy of this wonderful catalog from Still North Books, and that's the last plug from me, sorry. So Form and Relation examines the work of 6 North American Indigenous artists, including one of our guests today, Ruben, who I'll introduce in just a moment. Artists whose practices are grounded in our relationships to the land and one another. Using the flesh of the earth or clay as a central organizing medium, the artists in this exhibition draw not only on the materiality of the clay, but also on the capacity for the land and these forms to hold knowledge. With this in mind, I'm incredibly grateful to have Reuben Olgain and Michelle Lee Brown with us today, so we can talk about some of Reuben's work in the exhibition, as well as Michelle's incredible class she's teaching this term, Making Kin with Technology. But we'll also talk about ancestral technology, making kin with machines, and imagining Indigenous futures. Michelle Lee Brown is an Eastman Fellow at Dartmouth College in the Native American and Indigenous Studies Department. Her work articulates Indigenous political praxis and futures through digital SF. She has published peer-reviewed work on the Never Alone video game and a methods chapter on Indigenous approaches to video game research, and Liminal, a comic in the recent Relational Constellation collection from, is it Michigan State or Minnesota? Michigan State University Press. As soon as I said it, I was like, oh, I know it's Michigan State. That's what they do. Michigan State University Press and Native Realities Press. She is currently working on a VR project on water and eel relationality and a comic based on multiple levels of imposter syndrome. Her dissertation, titled Recoding Survivance Relation-Oriented Ontologies of Indigenous Digital Media, is done and has been successfully defended. So welcome to Dr. Michelle Lee Brown. I don't know if that's the first time you've been introduced in a talk that way since it was all done, but it's always nice when you first get it to hear that often. So thank you, Dr. Brown, for being here today. Michelle is Escalduna from La Purdy, the Biarritz area, but grew up on Wampanoag territory around Buzzards Bay in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. She strives to uphold her relational commitments to these communities and others whose lands and waters she works and lives on. Reuben Olgain is a New Mexico-based artist working in ceramics, Adobe, sound, video, and electronic media. His work draws on his mixed Pueblo and Spanish heritage, and he uses hand processes for sculpture and incorporates electronic elements. His work has been exhibited internationally, showing in Germany, as well as domestically in Miami, Santa Fe, Taos, and right here in Hanover, New Hampshire. Olguin completed an MFA in studio arts from the University of New Mexico, and a BA in cinematic arts, also from the University of New Mexico. And Ruben is now a faculty member and lab manager for experimental art and technology at the University of New Mexico. I feel like you can't escape the University of New Mexico, Ruben. They must treat you well. So thank you both for being here today. I just wanted to give you both an opportunity to introduce yourselves to our audience before we get started in conversation. So maybe if you'll introduce yourself and talk a little bit about like the path to where you are today. I know we have a lot of students in the audience who always appreciate the learning this from folks.
Michelle, do you want to start?
Okay.
I'll start. So I'm Ruben. I'm an artist and educator here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I think my paths have been very long and winding, right? I am the first person in my family to graduate college. I'm the first person in my family to get an advanced degree, my MFA. And I'm a land-based person, right? Our communities are very tight, and family and land is really important to us. You know, my family in the Indigenous side has been here for hundreds of years. The Nambe Pueblo dates back all the way to about 800 AD. And my Spanish heritage here has been here since the early 1700s. So the land is very important to us. Our family is really important to us. And as Jami pointed out, there's a lot of New Mexico and UNM involved in everything that I do. And I think that's one of the unique things that as an Indigenous person and someone that's sort of land and family based, that's one of the things that we always have to think about and compromise, I think, a lot, is how far away from our home do we want to be? And how much are we willing to sacrifice our access to our families in order to further our careers? And so I took the route of not compromising that, you know, and still attaining my educational goals that I had planned as a young person for myself in achieving my MFA. It was a goal that I had very early on. And so UNM is it, right? Like, we're a very limited college capacity here in New Mexico. And, you know, we don't have a lot of opportunities. And so UNM has been sort of a staple place here in New Mexico. And so I've utilized that as much as I can. Traveling throughout New Mexico. I worked for New Mexico State for a little while as a tenure track professor, but found my way back to the Albuquerque, northern New Mexico area because our land was calling me back home, you know? And so a lot of my work deals with the land, deals with the earth and the clay that is here. And being able to touch the clay is a way for me to touch my heritage and my ancestry in a way that living in the city sort of prevents me from being able to do. So I really did utilize that, but also growing up in the 20th century, having access to technology is a standard, right? Like, I remember when email first came out, right? I still have my Yahoo email from 1996, right? So I think technology is something that's pervasive in our society. And as growing up in a world of technology, I've found every opportunity that I can to sort of bridge those two worlds and to find sense and meaning and to understand where its capacities invade our sort of Indigenous realities and where they can align and help bridge new paths in the future.
Throwing it over to you, Ruben.
Yeah, go ahead, Michelle.
So, Ongi Tora Yemen's so welcome to all those here. Ikustin Saitustanak, Eta Ikustin S Saitustanak, those both seen and unseen. And it's been interesting because growing up, I was always taught that there's things around you both seen and unseen, right? But then suddenly when we're having these conversations and meetings on, and through digital media, there's all kinds of communities that are impacted and that are drawn from resources wise to enable us to have these conversations. So that opening for me has had these additional layers of meaning, as we've been doing sort of more virtual meetings and things like that. First, I want to thank Jami for putting this together. I'm really excited to listen and learn. And the more Ruben's been talking, the more I'm realizing I have so much to learn because I come from an ocean people, right? Where we're saltwater people, and for me, that's one of my primary understandings with who I am and what our primary relationship is, long after nation states happen and different, borders rise and fall. The ocean is what we come from and go back to. So for me, that's one of my primary relationships. And I really am interested in thinking now more about water and earth that makes these clay, processes and mediums. So how I got here, Jason I know is in the audience somewhere, so I'm gonna tease it, like, it's Jason's fault. Jason Edward Lewis and Skawanati came and did a presentation about their digital work in the beginning of my master's program. And it really sort of opened a path for me in Indigenous politics and future studies to be able to think about Indigenous digital media and Indigenous technologies and how Indigenous protocols can shape technology protocols. And really a lot of the work I do in the class I'm teaching now is asking, what do we mean by advanced technology? This keyboard that is going to be obsolescent in maybe a year, maybe 2 years, and then it's going to take centuries to break down. Is that really an advanced technology? And what do we mean by that in terms of futures thinking and thinking about the health of communities, both human and non-human? Yeah, I'll leave it at that for now. Thanks.
So, you both have kind of brought up the idea of relationships, and I know Michelle, or both of you, think a lot about relationality within your work. But I'm also thinking about this particular moment and how we're, having this conversation in Zoom and not necessarily in the gallery. Do you think that your work in technology prepared you for this past year in a different way? Or do you think, just thinking about reflecting on this past year, but also thinking if there are opportunities for your work that have come out of this focus on the digital and all of our relationships being mediated through technology?
I'll go first, I guess, if you want, Ruben. I'll give you a chance to reflect more. I think for me, it has. I've also, I have ADHD and some other, learning disabilities that tend to cluster with ADHD diagnosis. So for me, I'm always thinking about technology and access for students. And so in my teaching and in my learning, I've always been thinking about ways technologies can assist people, with learning and absorption and retention and repetition and things like that. So I think that's also prepared me for, having to do more, virtual or distance meetings and gatherings and presentations. But I think there's also been an incredible moment now where, and I want to thank a lot of the Black media, critical media scholarship that's come out recently, like Coded Bias just came out on Netflix. And I was so grateful that came out because it made it a lot easier to talk with my students about what we mean when we talk about, how there are these, dominant cultural assumptions built into the technologies and systems that we use. They come out of particular social and political contexts. And so there's been just this upsurge in the past year to 6 months of that coming into sort of the public awareness in different articles and media forms. So I'm really grateful for that because it's a lot easier than to help students understand it and present it to them in smaller bite-sized pieces than it was, say, a year to 2 years ago.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think as a digital artist, you know, I grew up with computers all the time, right? And so it's a language that I understand fluently. And I think when the pandemic hit and we were all sort of thrown online, I had a lot of faculty that had never really even done grades online, let alone trying to teach an entire class online. And so I felt like I had a pretty big advantage over that because I've been coding websites since I was 12. And so I think jumping into that was a really easy transition for me, but also understanding that growing up in a sort of landlocked situation and being sort of place bound, I understand a lot more the difficulties that a lot of my students could potentially have in accessing content online, and also the difficulties that they have coming to physical campuses online. So both of those are problems that technology can either amplify or help alleviate depending on how we use the technology. And I think it's really important to understand that technology doesn't exist without human input, right? Like it will only reflect and process information that we give it. And as Michelle pointed out, coded bias, you know, it just came out on Netflix, but it's an amazing video that talks a lot about our interpersonal and social connections to technologies and how our technologies reflect the inherent biases that are within human nature itself, right? And so everybody has some kind of bias in one form or another, and all technology will do is maybe amplify that in a lot of ways, or we can make the choice to use the technology in a productive and proactive way. And so for me, being able to be aware of the limitations of technology and the challenges technology can produce, I'm able to sort of mediate that and help facilitate situations a little bit better than I think other people that may not have my same experience would be able to do. So I think just having that knowledge of place-bound challenges of technology, people that are not technology fluent, and being able to sort of mediate all of that has been really difficult, but it is a challenge that I feel like I am a little more prepared to sort of tackle than people that are maybe not so familiar with technology, and also sort of the challenges of living and working in a rural area.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the challenges of living and working in a rural area. Um, I, live in more rural Vermont, and like my internet is not always reliable. But I also, have students who've been in my classes throughout the past year, who don't have access to high-speed internet, and we're like driving an hour to sit in a McDonald's parking lot to attend class, and or drive to a library parking lot to be able to use the internet. And I think that there's still a lot of kind of invisibility of the challenges and access that to resources like uh, internet, but also I think gets back to water, which you were talking about before. And it's, sometimes the same communities, I think, particularly if we're thinking about New Mexico and Arizona, thinking about, the extractive processes that have, you know, um, endangered the water supply or polluted the water supply within a lot of Indigenous communities. Um, and people just simply don't know about these histories. Oh, I'm going to start this over. So just so folks know, um, the images are scrolling through and they'll come back around. So don't feel like you've missed something, but in order to facilitate more of a conversation and less of a presentation from Michelle and Ruben, we are just kind of scrolling through some of these images in order to, I should have looped it. I always forget something. In order to kind of show their work, but also not have it be a lecture style conversation. So actually, this image that I'm seeing here, Ruben, is from your visit here last March, where our wonderful colleagues in the Hopkins Center for the Arts and the Ceramic Studio facilitated a workshop where you made adobe bricks for an installation that you have in the galleries. Can you talk a little bit about Fractured Broken Landscapes, that series, and the experience of making work with students?
Yeah, so I think a lot of times when you're making artwork, people feel like there's like some magic experience that the artist has to be able to just create something by touching things. And I think as an Indigenous artist, that's not true, right? Because a lot of what we do relies on the work and efforts of the people that came before us, our elders that taught us how to use these technologies from our ancestry and our past. And you know, I wouldn't know how to make adobe if my grandparents didn't show me how to make adobe. I wouldn't know how to make ceramics if my mentors didn't show me how to make ceramics and dig the clay and process and those kinds of things. So one of the things I like to do is bring the community back into the process of the making of the art, because really art is a community process. It's for people and it should be help facilitated, and the information should always be passed on. So I think historically art has been a very sort of self-contained process where we very rarely share information and technologies with others. But I feel like as a community member, it's important to share that sort of experience. And so with these broken landscapes works, one of the things I was sort of looking at was the limitations in access to natural resources of the Indigenous peoples in our area. And the way that those landscapes have been fractured and broken through colonization, through land ownership, through the loss of land ownership in the Indigenous peoples in this region, access to resources such as water, access to cultural resources such as clay. The earth itself is a cultural resource here. And water is the most prevalent and the most fought upon resource that we have. And so in trying to find access to clay in our local area, and in trying to find these natural resources and trying to recreate these natural processes that we've been using for hundreds of years, you can't really get access to those anymore. And so I had to hop fences. I've had to, you know, climb in other areas. Out here in New Mexico, we have an acequia system, which is sort of a community-based watering and irrigation system. So we as a community for the last 500 years have been diverting water from the rivers to help water our fields within the communities. And the whole community helps maintain this waterway system, which includes cleaning out the ditches, maintaining the waterways, opening and closing water, making sure that we only use the amount of water that we need in order for that water to flow through. And a lot of those processes have been hindered by sort of this modern sort of American invasion of our landscape, where these people have no connection to this history and the way that these systems have been used. If my family had been going on to this farmland on a land grant for the last 300 years to gain clay, to gather rocks, or other sorts of resources that we use, a new family may move in and buy this ranch, and all of a sudden they lock everything off and we no longer have access to these resources. And it's extremely problematic for our communities to be able to gain access to our cultural and historical resources. And so just learning the processes of being able to do that. And so when I came out to the hood, I invited people to come into the studio and help make these adobe bricks that ultimately were part of the sculpture. And so just the process of adobe making in my family has always been a community involvement, right? Like one person making adobe is extremely hard, but if the entire community comes out to make adobes, you can build a house in a day, right? And so that was generally the way that it has always been. Pueblo people have been extremely resourceful. So from knocking down villages in revolts and rebuilding entire towns in just a year is an extremely huge feat that requires a large community sort of organization. And I feel like our people here, the Tewa people, are really good at being able to achieve those kinds of goals. And so I wanted to go out and spread some of that information and just allow people to experience what it's like to create something together as a community, to build something with a common purpose.
Michelle, I want to give you an opportunity. I see you writing notes down, and so I want to give you an opportunity to respond to that if you want, or. Okay, I'll go to the.
Yeah. I was just thinking about how I put some images up and let Jami pick and choose among them. And I thought most of them were going to be about the Eel Project, which my students are going to be probably hearing way too much about this semester. But I was really excited that you chose the comic, which was really interesting to me because it was a comic I had made digitally. So I was asked if I'd like to be part of a comic collection by Elizabeth LaPontae. And what was fascinating to me was I was constrained by the tools I had, which was at the time a 9-year-old iMac and like a free version of, it was like Photoshop Elements someone had given me that was already like a 1.5 years old at the time. So I had these limited constraints, did not have a tablet, did not have anything. And so what I did was map painting and think of the comic as a way to work through, like Ruben had noted, being the first in your family to, you know what I mean, to go to college, to get an advanced degree, to get any kind of degree. And it's just somehow being thrown into that and my family just trusting I'll figure it out. Like that was part of my purpose was, you know, you're going to do this for us. And I had no idea what I was doing. There's a lot of, you know, I mean, yeah, sometimes colonization is strange and it's weird for our community too, because we were and are still being colonized by France and Spain, but have been a part of settler colonial projects elsewhere. So for me, it's also thinking about my own positionality and reciprocity and what does it mean when I'm on other people's lands and waters. And I was trying to think through all of those ideas. And of course, being a water person, I came back to fish and a flying fish and a rhino. And then my grandmother, my Nana, being the giant squid that's in that particular comic. And so it was a way to think through those things in a way that made sense to me. And what was wonderful was wound up making sense to, you know, Beth and the editing board they had for that comic collection. And at the time I was working on it, I was also a part of the Skins Hey Ao Ho, the Skins 5.0 Hey Ao Ho collective, which was a Native Hawaiian video game workshop. And Jason Edward Lewis in Concordia was working with Kaneokana in Hawaii, part of Kamehameha Schools, to have 16 participants come together to build a video game from scratch in 3 weeks. And what I found is the participant observer, you know, I'm doing entrance and exit interviews and you're sort of, you know, they're like, this is awkward, you know, but what helped me connect with a lot of the participants was me showing them some of my work and talking about it with them on the breaks. And they're like, oh, and then, you know, they were like, oh, there's a whole genre called back painting and there's lots of YouTube videos and people sharing experiences and things like that. So it was interesting that all of this was done digitally. But the images I was taking, I was thinking about where they came from, which is very much, you know, a part of what Elizabeth LaPontae does with their work. And yeah, and it just wound up helping me connect with the students there in Hawaii as they're working on the Native Hawaiian video game, you know, and it was also me thinking through what does it mean to, you know, to go through all these experiences also with undiagnosed, you know what I mean, learning disabilities that I didn't get diagnosed until I was about 2/3 or halfway through my PhD program. You know, and that again, not quite knowing how to fit in or not quite knowing what was wanted. And that I'm working on in the Imposter Syndrome series, which is that sort of monstrous, sort of like raptor bird looking image. That's a separate comic that I'm working on with someone else called Imposter Syndrome, which is about, you know, sitting in graduate seminars, you know, hearing all these, you know, Foucauldian and Deleuzian and all these like white Western theorist adjectives being thrown around and it not relating to you, the communities you're working with or the work you want to do. So, and what I find fascinating is even though the comic hasn't been published yet, when I've shown it or talked about it, how it's been generative for people in different ways. And that I find really exciting too. So even though the comic is sort of stalled out right now, it's actually had this unexpected life in different ways. And people have been asking about it or writing or sketching their own versions of it about how they felt going through it as well. So that's been really interesting for me to think about in terms of relationality and pop culture. In particular in this instance.
Well, I think that's a really good point, Michelle, in that as an artist, we're always expected to have like absolute outputs for things, right? And I think a lot of times the act of the making and the training and the teaching and the passing along knowledge and representing yourself as a leader within the community and within the broader community as well is a huge thing to these kids that are growing up that haven't seen that haven't looked at someone that can represent them or looks like them or even has a mentality that is similar to their own, right? So I think whenever I do workshops, they're always so focused on what is this final product going to be. But for me, it's as much the teaching and the representation part of it that means so much to the students as they come out of it. I taught a workshop here in Albuquerque, which was projection mapping, and it was at a little nonprofit school. I only had 5 students and I got a grant to do it. And the grant, when you're done writing a grant, you got to fill out all of these forms on, what you did and how you did it, how did you spend your money and all this stuff, right? And it's so output based, right? What was the final product and what was the final thing that was made? And to me, that is the least important part of the whole matter, because I sat in a room with 5 students that all had sort of Latin backgrounds and Indigenous backgrounds in various ways that had never seen someone like me at the front of the classroom before. One of these students didn't even know anybody that had ever been to college that had brown skin before. And so I think one of those things was just being there and representing and producing something and teaching them that Indigenous people can have a relationship with technology, right? And we don't have to be stuck in the past, and everything that we do is an evolution of everything that has come before us. And I think here in our region, the Pueblo people, we have a tradition of learning new technologies and accepting it and bringing people into our regions, and that was one of the reasons why the Spanish settled here, was because we invited them to hang out with us, right? We invited them to teach us their technologies, and we were willing to help teach them our technologies. We understood that reciprocity and cooperation build strong communities, and we had a history of taking in other villages. If one village had an issue or a problem, we would bring that village in, right? In the mid 1700s, a Tewa village moved all the way out to Arizona, almost 600 miles away, to go live with another village, and incorporating their ideas and values is part of our culture, right? This incorporation and evolution of technology is part of it. Kind of backfired on us for a little while, but at the same time, it didn't change our mentality, right? Going through all of that, we are still a highly accepting community, and we still incorporate technologies, and we're still really willing to work with the outside communities as long as they're willing to work with us. So I think even through all of that trauma of historical turmoil, we have not lost that as a people and as a community. And I think that's really important to maintain, that that is the tradition, right? Because ceramics is a technology in itself, right? The adobe brick that I'm making here on the screen is a technology. The Pueblo people didn't make bricks before the Spanish came, right? And the Spanish didn't make adobe bricks before they met the Moors. And so it was one of those evolutions where one technology is passed on to another and incorporated and evolves. And so we are one of those peoples that is able to take that into cooperation. And I think our relationship with technology sort of reflects that. I've worked with a lot of students here at the university from the Navajo reservations, from the Apache reservations, from all of the Pueblo reservations, that all are really willing to accept technology to evolve some of the more traditional ways of knowing and understanding. But there are limitations to that, and understanding that it can't solve all of our problems. And if we rely on technology to solve our problems, either cultural or technical, physical, mechanical, or whatever, we have to understand that there has to be a mediation process. We have to understand how these can be used and how they can be incorporated and where they shouldn't be incorporated, right? So we have a lot of state-controlled historical sites here and federally controlled historical sites here that actually live inside of the reservation. So in my family's home in Bernalillo, on my mother's side, on the Spanish side, we're right next to the Santa Ana Pueblo. And right in the middle of the Santa Ana Pueblo, there's this little tiny area that's federally owned that is a historical village to the Santa Ana people. But it's an architecturally, archaeologically controlled sort of area. So it was excavated, it was discovered in the 1920s, right? And so they came in, they took it, it becomes state land, and they actually have a kiva in that region. And one of the technologies they tried to do was to capture the images in the kiva. The kivas in our societies is extremely sacred. And even people that live within the village may never actually see the inside of the kiva, right? But when they took over, they wanted to photograph the images. They wanted to copy the images and preserve them, even though they had been preserved for nearly 500 years before the archaeologists even came around. They felt there was some kind of need to preserve these images. And preserving things in a permanent state has never been the practice of the Pueblo people to begin with. But then they took these images and displayed them to the public without any consultation with the Pueblo people. They're using these technologies in an invasive and destructive way and stripping us of our rights as a culture. And there's a lot of places that do this. And when people go down into this kiva, they're allowed to take pictures. And so there's a lot of problems with that, you know, being able to share this information and this technology readily across, you know, a lot of different platforms. And the people that originally came from this area weren't even allowed to go down in there because the societies limit that information to specific people that are the heads of the societies. The way information is passed down is very specific within a lot of the societies here in the Pueblo people. And the colonial settler and archaeologists didn't really respect any of that or even care. So, and it's still a problem. The Santa Ana people have been fighting for the last 50 years to take that sort of archaeological site back into the Pueblo's hands. They're allowed to put a giant casino right next to it, but they're not allowed to control their own historical heritage sites. So it's extremely problematic in that way, that technology has been used in that way. And so, you know, you can go into this site and you can take a look at these images, you can go down there, you can photograph them. But, you know, for a lot of the Pueblo people, they refuse to even step into that kiva because for us, we're not allowed to be in there unless we've been given permission by our society and been invited down into those areas. But the tourists are more than welcome to go in there 5 days out of the week.
You bring up, both of you have brought up interesting points about like the kind of like Western assumption that, you know, knowledge is for everyone. And also the way that knowledge has been passed down to you both, and how that impacts the work that you do. But we all work within Western academic institutions. How do you navigate the kind of the tenuous relationships between, you know, accountability to your community and expectations of operating within Western academic spaces?
I think for me, I also want to think about like fractured communities, you know what I mean? And people who grew up away from home communities. And that's something I think about with like adoption and kinship practices, you know what I mean? And among people, but also human and non-human relations as well. And one of the things I was thinking about when Ruben was talking about information being passed down is I also want to give thanks to Kari Noe because I think she's somewhere in the audience. She did that beautiful illustration of that biotechnical eel for me. And that was me thinking about what do you do? And I actually hadn't realized and fully articulated this part until this moment, is what do you do when you have these practices passed down to you, but you're literally away from your home territories and those eels are being over harvested almost to the point to extinction. Like, what do you do with that? You know what I mean? Like it was a huge cause of stress for me. And what's been fascinating to me is being here at Dartmouth, you know, the Newcomb Institute gave me money to work on the Eel Elder VR project, you know what I mean? Which is thinking through a human underwater engaging with an eel as an elder, and the eel will give them teachings if the human has shown correct behavior and interacted with the eel properly. And that includes when you enter and exit the VR sessions. And the Curator project is also thinking about biotechnical eels. So how can we keep these relational protocols going in different ways and think about technologies that can be sort of reoriented towards our particular ways of understanding things. And what's been fascinating to me is how different universities in Canada, in the United States, in Oceania have helped support that work and are interested in it. So it's always a reminder for me to not necessarily put up those hard barriers that there can be, you have to understand the parameters, like Ruben was talking about the grants, there's certain expectations and outputs you have to have. But what's been fascinating for me is the kind of work I can do, which has helped me as a person sort of heal and think about ways to sort of breathe renewed life, I guess, into some of these cultural practices and reorient ourselves to what does it mean sometimes when we're on other people's lands and waters, or when we're away from communities or we don't have access to them in the ways that others may.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think technology has the ability to go beyond that. My mentor, Clarence Cruz, who's an elder in Okewinge, when I was going through grad school, he was on my committee, and he, had all the obligations to the university. But at that time, he had been elected to be war chief in his village, which had this huge cultural, involvement in being part of the community. And he, effectively told the university, I have obligations over here, and if I need to be there, I have to be there. So if the village calls, you have to drop everything and you have to go. Being a knowledge bearer in our societies means that knowledge has to be shared with the community, and there are specific guidelines on how that knowledge can be shared with the community. One of the issues that we have here is language. A lot of the young people are not growing up around elders that are in the village. They're living in the cities. They're not being exposed to our traditional languages. And how do you learn those languages? Language is something that must be spoken and spoke to people that understand the language. That's how human beings develop language of all kinds. And so I think the more you use a language, the more you're going to be able to understand how that language is meant to be used. Some of the solutions that we've had out here has been to teach virtual language classes to various degrees of success. And even in the Tewa language here, we actually have multiple different variants. Every village has their own dialect of the Tewa. Even we call it Tewa, but there's like the Nambe Tewa, there's the Okewinge Tewa, there's the Tesuge Tewa. So there's all of these different variants of the language. And even on top of that, now we have a more consolidated version through the Tewa language project that's been done out here. They're trying to make it accessible and have language classes available to people that don't live in the villages, so that way they can at least learn some of the language and have access to it. I grew up far away. My family moved to Arizona. I grew up in Tucson. And so I have access to the village, and I didn't have access to some of our traditional practices. I had to learn most of that information as an adult coming back here. And so for me, having access to technology and having access to books, having access to videos and these sort of virtual language has been a huge way for me to be able to incorporate some of that into my everyday life, things that had been lost to me as a child. But at the same time, within the villages, they also believe that some of the language has to be taught in person. And there was a clash when some of the villages decided to actually make a dictionary of the Tewa language. Some of the villages said that that was against the traditions, and they refused to be a part of that. And so that's some of the balances that we have to play here, as incorporating technology and not incorporating technology, and understanding how the evolution of this is going to come to be. Now, one of the questions Jami asked was like, what do you do when your conflict of your professional career conflicts with your requirements to your family, and to your land? And to me, that really struck home, because I had a tenure track position in New Mexico State down south. And I had, my family was really struggling. My mother was trying to run this family on her own. She was recovering from cancer, and she really needed my help. She needed the children, because the children are a big part of her life. And so my kids were a way for her to sort of see the future rather than living by herself and struggling with these medical problems, and then looking at her land in the back just sort of deteriorating and falling away. I quit my job and I moved back to New Mexico, and I moved back north so that way I could live with my mom and help her come back and help her rebuild her home and help her rebuild her land. And you know, now I live back in Albuquerque, but I'm still there, and we go over there every weekend, and I see my mom all the time, and she sees my kids all the time. And I can tell when I get there, she's very, like, you know, tight, and, you know, she's very tense. And just with the kids being there for an hour, you could see her whole mentality has shifted. So for me, the professional career will have to adapt to my responsibilities to the village and my responsibilities to my family. Those are always going to come first in my home. That's really important. And making the effort to go back and put my, you know, feet in the dirt and to try to grow some of our traditional crops, and doing those kinds of things are really important. And these crops can't be grown in other places, right? Some of the squashes that we have that have been passed down for generations, the corns that have been given to me from our elders. One of the things we're growing is Pueblo Corn. That was a technology that has been sort of fading, the cotton industry. So Pueblo people have been growing cotton since before the Spanish came, and our seeds were stripped away from us with the invention of the cotton gin, and with the cotton industry in America, basically took away our cotton resources. And so there have been some families that have been reviving some of these heritage Pueblo cottons. And I was given some of those seeds by a Santa Clara elder, and she gave me some cotton seeds, and I've been sort of regrowing those seeds and then attending seed swaps and passing that traditional cotton back out. But you know, there are commercial cotton fields here in New Mexico, and there are laws on cross pollination between commercial cottons and traditional cottons. So our cottons are not white, right? They're like greenish, they're grayish, they're brownish. But if they contaminate a GMO field that has the technologies of GMOs in it, and an entire field of white cotton comes out and becomes green, that's a huge problem for those farmers. But it's also a problem for us to not be able to maintain our traditional plants and our traditional ways of life.
I think a lot of what you both have said too, and I think just the, you know, how much you're willing to share of yourselves, even in a public talk like this, really goes to show you the strength of your relationships. And I think it makes you both better researchers, better artists, better professors. I want to get to the Q&A. We do have a couple of questions, but those of you in the audience, feel free to add more. I know Michelle and I both have students who are in the audience, so feel free to ask more questions. We have a question from Suzanne, who asked, the round pots with a hole, this series here. Can you talk about these? The interpretation from Suzanne is a spike and antenna that makes a connection between ancient and modern techniques.
So this work came out of just my practices of collecting traditional clays. So I'd go out into the land and I do what's called wild harvesting of clay. I find clay, I try to identify sites of where traditional clay had been dug by different villages or villages that don't exist anymore, and pull that clay and sort of revive that clay and use it in our traditional pottery making way. But being out in the middle of nowhere where you can't even hear a car, there's always motor noise. So car noise can echo through canyons from very far away. There's always airplanes sort of flying overhead. And it got me thinking about sort of the sonic invasion within the landscape, right? And the colonization, not of the physical land, but of the sound environment as well, right? It has an impact on wildlife. It has an impact on the communities. In Taos, they tried building to expand the airstrip that's there, which is really close to the Taos Pueblo, which is made completely out of adobe. And adobe is really susceptible to vibration. And they felt that if they increase the size of the airplanes that would be landing there and increase the frequency of the amount of planes that would be landing, the vibration, the sound vibrations would effectively start jiggling the houses apart. It would effectively destroy the houses. And there's a lot of evidence that a lot of adobe houses that were next to highways are now deteriorating and falling apart because of the vibration of the car traffic that's going through there. So I wanted to look at the impact of sound on our traditions. And so what these are actually resonators. Most pots are designed to hold water or to hold, you know, flowers or to hold food or grain and those kinds of things. These pots are designed to hold sound. And what they do is they have been tuned using a scientific equation to capture very specific slices of noise in the environment. And they signal in on mechanical noise and electronic noise. So they're all frequencies that capture resonances on the 50 hertz or the 60 hertz cycle. So if you've ever heard the hum of your TV, or if you've ever walked by a lamppost and heard the hum coming from the lamp, those are all 50 and 60 hertz hums, 60 hertz cycles, which are the kind of sounds that are being produced by mechanical and electronic devices. And so these are meant to capture that. And if you listen into them and there's that kind of noise in the environment, they'll start to hum. And so each one of them has a specific pitch. So the larger ones can capture deeper sounds and the smaller ones capture higher pitch sounds. So they become like a choir that is taking these traditional materials and interpreting the sounds of the modern sonic mechanical environment and sort of taking them in and capturing them and holding those sounds.
We have a question from Jenny Swanson from the Ceramic Studio, who says that we loved working with you last year and learned so much about the art and craft of adobe bricks. Can you talk a little bit about the process for making your sculptural vessels?
Yeah, so again, like capturing wild clay is actually a really difficult process. You learn to read the land, right? And as Michelle knows, you're a water person. You don't see what's happening to the land underneath all of that water. Come to New Mexico, you can see what the ocean looks like when all the water has gone away. I heard this really awesome quote from a colleague of mine who said, you know, the desert is the memory of the water, right? And so you're looking at the land and you start to see where the life was living, where the different parts of the world as the water washed away was. And so what we do is we go out and we find clay deposits, and you have to understand how to read the land, how to read the natural resources that are on top of it, and identify where clay sources could be. And then you have testing to try to figure out what clay sources can actually be turned into ceramics, which have enough pure clay, how to modify them with other minerals we find in the landscapes. Another material we have is tufa, which is volcanic ash. So we had a lot of volcanoes out here, and whenever they erupted, their ash left deposits in our landscape. So as you go through the landscape, you can identify the strata in the landscape of where the volcanic ash deposits are. So we have to gain a lot of different materials and minerals, looking for different clays of different colors that have secondary minerals in them, and testing those to be able to make that. And then all of my work is traditionally fired. So we fire them in animal dung. Traditionally, it would have either been buffalo or antelope or deer dung. Nowadays, we have a lot of cows in New Mexico, so I harvest cow dung from my neighbor farms around me. And, you know, we put all the pottery in a big pit. We sort of cover them in other broken ceramics and then fire them all at once. And it's this big, massive display of fire. And I always get helicopters flying over our property whenever we're doing fire to make sure that it's not a fire in the bosque or a structure fire. But so traditional firing, traditional hand process and traditional techniques. I learned my pottery through my mentor, Clarence Cruz of Olguin. And that's generally how a lot of Pueblo potters learn, is by watching other potters. But there's a lot of videos that show traditional pottery making techniques from historical potters on YouTube. Maria Martinez has a video showing how to make the black pottery of Santa Clara. And there's a lot of other elders that have those videos online. But yeah, it's mostly experience learning how to make those, and they're all traditional wild harvested clay. The colors and the slips that we use are all wild harvested slips.
It's so interesting the way my aunt Jerry Redcorn is a Caddo potter. And when I was a grad student at Chapel Hill, she came out to do a talk, and it was like the archaeology department who brought her out, and they were asking her like, well, what's the ratio of, you know, clay to, you know, to like the, you know, micaceous stone that you're putting in. And she's like, well, you know, it's, you feel it. And they were like, but would you say it's like 40-60 or, you know? And she's like, wasn't willing to give them the answer they wanted. And it was just this great memory of like, you have to know, you have to feel it, you have to experience it. And I think that, you know, we've lost a lot of that in our educational system, and the importance of like experiencing and sharing and visiting as a means to obtain knowledge and learn about the world around you.
Yeah. I think we have a tendency to want to have like these very scientific, measurable ways of being able to produce and experience things. And the truth is, it doesn't work that way. If I get clay from a site and I go back to that site next season and try to get more clay, I'm dealing with a completely different body of clay, right? There's been washouts, the mineral has leached. There's been microorganisms that have been eating that clay between seasons, right? So every time you go out, it's a little bit different. And so there is no absolute answer for those kinds of things. You have to just experience it and learn how to experience the clay. It's sight, it's smell, it's taste, I guess. I taste all of my clay. It's all part of just the experience. You could tell if there's salt in clay, I guess is one way to sort of backtrack on that. If you want to know if there's salt, so salt is one of those things that could damage clay or prevent it from solidifying. Salt can cause a lot of problems in the firing process. So we want to find clay that doesn't have sodium or any kind of like extra salts in it. And so we taste it. And if the clay tastes salty, it's not really a good clay to use, right? You want something that tastes irony or coppery or minerally. You don't want it to taste like salty. And so taste is a big part of that component. I mean, how do you tell a scientist, you know, you got to taste that clay before you know whether it's good or not? You know, that's not something that you can really do. The dryness of the clay, you know, if it sucks the moisture away from your tongue when you put it on your tongue, that's a sign that it has a high clay content in it. And there's no traditional pottery that's throwing it into a machine that can sort of whiz it around and separate the minerals and measure exactly how much it is. We make little tiny pots, right? I'll make a little test pot with that clay and fire it and see what happens, and then make amendments to the clay based off of that. So it is less of a scientific process when you're dealing with those. If I get clay from the store, they've already done all of that work. They take clay samples, they send the clay sample out to a lab that tests the mineral components of that clay. It comes back, they learn how to amend that clay, how it needs to be pugged and smashed and all of this other stuff. It's a very mechanical process. Out here, I throw my clay into a bucket and I just step on it, right? And that's kind of how we mix our clay here. It doesn't go into a pug, it doesn't go into a mill. It's all sort of hand processed, and you know, you're in your hands, you're getting dirty, you're physical with it. It's a very physical process.
We've got one more question and a minute left. We have a question, Michelle, I'll throw this one to you. How do you see the role of technology in keeping knowledge alive and available to future generations? How can we make it a living knowledge and not just an archive?
So that's part of the Eel Elder VR I'm working on is, so you're interacting with an eel as an elder, and then based on certain variables like the moon phase, what hemisphere you're in, what season it is, there'll be certain grouping of teachings that the eel could give you that are in our language. And these are cultural teachings. And the idea is you have to interact with the eel in certain ways because it's an elder and a teacher, right? So there's certain protocols you have to observe. For example, you have to ask to end the session every time. And if you just decide to take off the headset like you're done, and the elder had said, no, we have one more thing to do before we end the session, it may not appear next time. And you have to rebuild your relationship with it again in order to be ready and show it that you're ready to receive some of these teachings. And what's been fascinating is working with cultural practitioners in our home communities and figuring out what's the most appropriate sets to share. And then also part of my learning was I had to become a better speaker because I'm not a speaker yet. And so for them, one of the best things they can do is make sure our language lives on. So I'm learning our dialect, and I finally found a tutor that can meet with me a few times a week to make sure, because for me, it's also really important to learn our dialect. It's about 10% of the Basque speaking population, or Euskara speaking population, speaks that particular French Basque dialect. And for me, I'd heard it from my nana growing up. So it was really important for me to have that be the first one I really learned, and sort of anchored in my gray matter. But I think there are ways to think through relationality and technology. But as Ruben said, it's never cut apart from humans and human contact and exchanges. But I also wanted to think of ways we could have people start to orient themselves and learn some of the foundational aspects so that they could then be ready to sort of take a deeper dive in and learn more about culture and teaching. So it's something I'm trying to think about too, is how you can help people build up a base level without drawing too much on elders and speakers who are already so overstretched. That was one of the things I'm trying to think about in the work and creative projects I'm doing.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for sharing your time and knowledge with us. And this was a wonderful conversation. And I just can't wait until we can do these kinds of things in person again, and maybe with some clay. And thank you so much. And thanks again to Sharon. Sharon, do you have any other announcements?
Yeah, I just wanted to give a really warm thank you to all of you today, Ruben, Michelle, and Jami. Thank you for that wonderful conversation. Again, this will be up on the Hood Museum's YouTube channel shortly, so you can revisit it, you can share it. And we will be sending out a follow-up email tomorrow with a very brief Google survey. And if you could take just a moment to fill that out, that helps us continue to improve our programs for you. And thank you so much. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to everybody that came. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, everyone, for having me.
Thanks, Sharon.